So hello and welcome to How to Tell if a Sourcer Recruiter is as good as they claim. This is Lamis Abu-Rama with the Recruitment Process Outsourcing Association and host of the RPO Leadership Forum, a monthly webinar series hosted by the RPOA and presented by top industry leaders on current talent acquisition topics. If this is your first time, welcome. If you're a returning participant to our webinar program, welcome back. We're excited you could join us and hope you'll enjoy the event. Please chime in the chat and introduce yourself. Tell us where you're joining us from. Note that we're using Zoom webinar. It is slightly different. You will need to click on the drop arrow to send your message to the panelists and participants, and we do encourage you to do so. Today's webinar is expected to be 60 minutes long. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a link to the recording by tomorrow. Now, without any further ado, I'm very excited to welcome back a great friend of the RPOA and a returning speaker to the program, Patty Silbert, Executive Vice President of Talent Strategy and Acquisition at Aspirant. Patty has over 30 years of experience developing innovative solutions that help HR professionals meet their most pressing recruitment challenges and their companies achieve their talent acquisition goals. I'm also thrilled to welcome a new speaker to the program and a legend in the talent sourcing domain. Shally Steckerl is Vice President of Talent Strategy and Sourcing Innovation at Aspirant. Shally is a globally recognized recruiting leader who has helped build sourcing organizations for companies such as Microsoft, Google, Coca-Cola, Cisco, and Motorola. He's a writer, a public speaker, and adjunct professor at Temple University in Philadelphia. Shally is currently the Director of Power Sourcing at Aspirant and serves as Director for the Sourcing Institute Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing recruiting industry education and opportunities to underserved communities. As we mentioned, Shally is joining us from Atlanta, and Patty is joining us from the greater Pittsburgh area. I should also mention that Aspirant is an RPOA member and a leading national consulting firm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. With that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Patty.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lamis, for that warm introduction, and welcome to everybody to our session today. And I think we all know what brought us here is the very fact that the war for talent is in full force, and the very nature of recruiting is changing, and organizations are needing to think about upskilling their current sourcing and recruiting teams, because we are all hearing the same sort of message as hiring managers lament over the fact that there's not enough talent. The speed in which talent is being presented to make hiring decisions is just not filling the need for organizations. And the reality of this are some hard numbers that we're faced with. Today, there's about 150,000 recruiter job openings in the US alone. This number takes into account every type of recruiter or sourcer job title that you can imagine, from sourcer, from technical recruiter, entry-level recruiter, junior, senior, from driver recruiter to pharmaceutical recruiter, and so on. And companies like Facebook have had a 1,500% increase from last year on the number of recruiter openings. And one leading pharma company, which is really looking at some of their data, has shown a 49,000% increase in recruiter posting titles, with over 500 recruiter titles posted this year alone from where they were last year. I get it. Some of that was pandemic related, but the need for recruiters has grown exponentially. And so we're all here today with the goal of finding ways to help our existing teams meet the demands of the businesses that we serve, the hiring managers that need our help in finding the best talent, And for many of us, I think we're recognizing that skill gap. So as you see here in our agenda, we're going to cover sort of a wide swath of topics and information. We're not going to get down into the nitty-gritty sort of techniques of sourcing overall, but the hope is that we all walk away with some knowledge and tips for improving the way in which we recruit and identify recruiting talent to help us meet the needs and serve of the business. And lastly, we're going to fill out with what we use as a recruiter assessment to help clients identify ways to fill those skill gaps and to also help us as we look to improve our recruiting solutions to the customers we serve. So as we move forward, what I do want to talk about through the next slide that we move into is that we're finding that 70% of the global workforce are considered passive candidates. And so that means when you're posting a job, you're only tapping into 30% of the workforce. And many of those individuals who are applying may not be the right fit for those roles as a whole. You know, Shally has been working in this area to really identify the specialized discipline of what really defines sourcing outside of what recruiting is. The recruiting roles have evolved over the years, and Shally has worked across many industries to help organizations understand the differences between those roles and titles. But we know that both are very critical to organizations. And so if you're limiting a lot of your TA strategy to waiting for those active talent members to apply for your opportunities, you're selling yourself short. And so what we're really focused on is helping you to identify the best ways for you to attract talent into the organization, and to also make sure that you're using a talent strategy that is helping you to find the best talent that's out there. And so this leads us to creating a full understanding of what are the differences between the two roles of sourcing. And so Shally is going to take us through that so you can understand specifically the way in which we differentiate these two roles.
Thank you for that, Patty. I started talking on mute. You can hear me, right, everybody? Good. Okay. So the role of the sourcer has evolved over the many years that I've been in this business, a little bit more than 25 years, I hesitate to even admit. It started out as something that every recruiter does, right? Sourcing your own candidates. And we used whatever means we had, for those of us that go way back to perhaps classified ads and faxing and all that. But what has happened as the role, like many other roles in industry, evolved is the creation of a specialization. So the sourcer role, however you define it, whatever the job title is essentially a specialization of the overall recruitment function. And it is a different job. It's a different job because recruiters work on the pipeline and use a pipeline of talent, whether that's from traditional means or from applicants coming in through website or any other traditional channels. They utilize that pipeline to the company's advantage by making hires from within that pipeline. So they use the pipeline to fill jobs. Whereas the sourcer's role is earlier in the process to find and engage prospects for now and for later. So for roles that are open now and for roles that may be open in the future, pipeline. And because these are different jobs, they require different metrics. Not all requisitions are the same. Not all positions are the same. Various levels, various criticality, and even the same position in different geographic locations has very different ways of being filled. The exact same position in one city may be easy to fill, and in another city may be extremely difficult for a number of reasons. So because all requisitions are not the same, and because not all roles have the same kind of inbound flow, the specialization of sourcing picks up where there is that gap. In other words, you've gone through the regular processes, you've gone through traditional means, traditional channels, and there's low or no candidate flow. Now we need to involve some proactive measures, and these could be executed by the recruiters themselves, who also have a lot of other responsibilities, including working with the hiring managers and being the HR representatives in many cases for compliance and auditing and all these other things. Or we can give that to a specialization, the sourcer, again, whichever job title you choose. And that specialization is then responsible for working on those much fewer positions that have a hard time being filled through the already established methods. This number could be 5, 10, 15, maybe as much as 30% of jobs, but it isn't the same thing and it isn't all jobs. So again, sourcers and recruiters are in different specializations. Sourcing is a specialization within recruiting, and it is the specialization that fills or basically creates that pipeline flow, which then the recruiters can leverage and fill requisitions. So one thing that has been coming across our desk quite a bit here at Aspirant and at our talent strategy and acquisition practice is a need to accelerate the identification, the interviewing and the selection, and essentially the hiring and onboarding and the getting up to speed of people in this role of recruiters and sourcers, however you define it. We've noticed that the need is so urgent that there are, in many ways, shortcuts being taken and companies making decisions that are not necessarily the same decisions they would make in a different market because of the speed at which you talk to a recruiter candidate and make them an offer, and the next day they've accepted an offer somewhere else. And it's really, really fast, and there's so much demand. So we've noticed that the selection process needs to be changed a little bit. Traditional interview questions don't necessarily work. We've put together for our own hiring needs technical and competency-based interviewing techniques. We've also made some sample tests that we provide candidates, and essentially it's a short project that they complete in a reasonable amount of time, similar to the amount of time that they would invest in, say, conducting an interview, being interviewed by the company. So we have some technical, we have some competency-based interviewing techniques, we have tests, and we have predefined criteria that we utilize to rate candidates during the selection process, whether it's their review of experience on paper, the review of their resume, or also the review of their scorecard throughout the interview process. So how do we conduct an effective interview and selection process for recruiters and sourcers in this extremely fast-paced, very demanding environment that we're experiencing now? I personally haven't seen anything since the .com days that was anywhere like this. In my experience back then was with software engineers and .com businesses. So never seen anything like this in recruiting. Well, there's a few steps. First, we need to develop a scorecard that helps us with evaluating their experience, but then also it helps us with evaluating the interview results or the phone screen results so that we have a fair and standard way of approaching and comparing candidates. The second step is to actively test their sourcing skill. Why? Why not test recruiting? Because recruiting is a lot more defined, and we're a lot better, a lot more knowledgeable, and have a lot more experience in selecting and interviewing recruiters. But sourcing being a more rapidly evolving, and a newer set of skills means that hiring managers that are hiring recruiters may not necessarily know what those skills are, how to ask those specific interview questions. So preparing a set of interview questions around the desired behaviors, the technical ability required, and some of the other core competencies such as independence and business acumen, creativity, curiosity, and focus allows us to be a lot more programmed in our approach on evaluating candidates so we can make better decisions in bringing on board qualified recruiters and sourcers that are more likely to be productive in our environment. The second part of what we see coming across, in addition to this selection and the pace simply of recruiting for recruiters, the second part of it is mistakes. Organizations that hire someone based on the same traditional interview questions that they've asked before, and then within a few days or a few weeks, as I've experienced multiple times in my own team, the person simply wasn't actually able to deliver on the technical requirements of doing the job. they sure looked great on paper and they answered all the right questions correctly, but then they just couldn't do the job. So that's the second part, right? It's now we hired them and we onboard them, and essentially we have to pretty much start over again. So happy to go into any of details if there's any questions around the behavioral and the technical questions. But I wanted to move on to answer another question, which comes up from the business many times. If we have recruiters, why do we need sourcers? What's the reasoning? Why do we need two people essentially doing the same job? Well, the answer is they really are not doing the same job. Sourcing techniques are constantly evolving day by day. If you want an example of this, log into LinkedIn tomorrow and you'll see something changed. Sure, it's still LinkedIn, but how we use it changes. How we use Facebook, how we use Twitter, how we use the internet, how we reach out to people. Are we calling? Are we emailing? Are we texting? All of those rules change constantly. And it's within the realm of the sourcer to keep abreast of these techniques and be able to leverage them on demand. That in and of itself is time consuming. So already recruiters are overwhelmed with all the responsibilities they have, expecting them to also stay abreast of techniques and all the evolving nature of them is a considerable burden. Another reason is that sourcers work with recruiters in a one-to-many ratio. A sourcer, a single person that is dedicated to the front of this pipeline, can support multiple pipelines because of the ebb and flow of demand. And as such, they can be feeding a set of recruiters. How many? Well, there's a formula for that. If you're interested in, let us know and happy to talk to you about it. But there's definitely a one-to-many relationship. So you can have one sourcer supporting 5, 10, et cetera, recruiters. And we need sourcers because the sourcers are the ones that are in a position, not just through their techniques and staying abreast of these techniques, but also they're in a position because they have the time and it is their charter to fill the pipeline. Pipeline filling doesn't necessarily always directly result in hires today. It results in hires tomorrow. And even more importantly, it results in faster hires tomorrow. So both jobs are necessary in some environments, and they are very different. Lastly, the internet is just a very big place. The rate at which information is being added to the internet, the rate at which people are creating profiles on whatever platform, whether it's LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Snapchat, you name it, is just simply faster than any one person could cover. So it is important that we have a specialization to address this vastness. Once we have the right people on board and we've made better decisions selecting them and onboarding them, we then turn to how do we measure to make sure that we're really evaluating what's unique about the role of a sourcer versus what's unique about the role of a recruiter. It's incredibly unfair to measure two people for the exact same outcome. It's okay, and it's not more than okay. It's certainly possible and very doable to share credit, but that's sharing a portion of the credit. You can't give full credit to two separate people for the same exact outcome. So for that, it's important that we begin to understand what sources do. We don't have to know how they do it. We don't need to see every single mechanism inside of the factory. Just understand what they do so that we can more clearly understand what needs to be accomplished and ask smarter questions. You don't need to be a sourcer in order to manage sourcers. You can use this information that sources generate, such as the methods they utilize, where they spend their time, where you should spend more of your budget, and where sourcing should pitch in for which roles, which geographies, et cetera. You can use this information as a way to make better decisions. So it informs your leadership decision in assigning resources. Do we need to hire more sourcers, or can one sourcer support multiple recruiters? Do we need more recruiters? Do we need to spend more on these platforms? Are we spending too much on these platforms? These are all decisions that sourcing can help inform. I'm going to illustrate the path of a hire in the new model where we have sourcing and recruiting working together in tandem. Whether the sourcer is an independent job function or sourcing is a part of recruiting, this is an illustration of what it takes these days and how it's changed from in the past. Before I started tracking these numbers about 20 or so years ago, it was kind of a guess. How many candidates do we need in order to make enough interviews in order to make a hire? So I started tracking this, and over the last 20 years, I developed a number that is typically somewhere between 100 to 150 leads result in a hire. That is, if sourcing is quality and everything is working in the process. Now, that ratio can be much bigger. In some cases, I've seen 300 leads to hire, but on average across multiple industries, it used to be about 100 to 150. What's happened is nowadays, it's looking a lot more like 200 for a number of reasons. So how do we work backwards from that? Well, to make a hire, we know that we'd like to present 5 qualified interested candidates to a hiring manager that they would like to interview. Sometimes hiring managers are happy interviewing 3, but they are seldom happy just interviewing one person. They usually want to have a choice. So let's shoot for 5. In order to have 5 qualified interested candidates, we need to produce 10 candidates that we could select a short list from to present to the hiring manager to end up with 5 that are being interviewed. The 10 qualified interested may not all necessarily be chosen by the hiring manager, and so on. Now, how do we get to 10 interested candidates? Well, we need to reach out and make connections, have conversations, send emails, make phone calls, text messages, Snapchat, Facebook, etc. Right? And we need to have about 25 connections. A recruiter and or a sourcer need to connect with about 25 people to produce 10 qualified interested on average. And the other way, there you go. That means that we need to pursue about 100 candidates, given the fact that at least 50% of the people that we pursue simply never respond, no matter how many times we text and email. That's a response rate of essentially about 25% from potential candidates, leads that we found, to candidates that actually reply. So as you can see, the funnel nowadays looks more like we generate 200 leads by some collection of mechanisms, or we have a pipeline with 200 leads that results in about 100 that we are able to pursue, 25 who respond, 10 who become interested and are qualified, 5 who are presented, and 1 that is hired. So if you're looking for a good general funnel metric, this is a picture of what we're seeing today in the average. And so this helps inform how you measure the productivity of the various areas. With that, I wanted to send things back to Patty to continue with the next slide.
So if you're wondering about all of this, as Shally talks through sort of this funnel of where do you begin, sourcers, recruiters, at the end of the day, everyone is expected to engage with potential candidates to fill open roles. So there's no doubt that if you're not using some formula in order to help your team members understand what they need to do to increase their productivity, you're going to be lost in this process. But I think what the underlying point of this is, and I'll share this story with you. I didn't grow up in the recruiting space. I came out of the recruitment marketing, as you saw from the bio that Lemise actually showed at the onset of this area. And so when I stepped into the RPO world in the full-fledged, full life cycle recruiting, my question in my own head was, how do I know what talent I have here? Right. And so the measurement of good may have looked like, well, how many positions does a recruiter fill at the end of the year? What are they filling on a monthly basis? And when starting to dig in and ask the questions of, how can we improve productivity? How can we meet the demands of the clients that we serve in order to help them find the best talent? I was sort of stuck in this spot of, well, what do they need? From training and development, and how do team members really improve their skills at the end of the day? And what I found was somewhat astonishing, because most organizations, if you're like ours, right, you provide training that's across the board. And some of that training may be around, how to use Excel, how to, maybe some of it's DE&I training that individuals go to, cultural training that organizations put on. But what I also found is that training budgets are cut first and budgeted last, just due to the lack of evidence of a positive return on investment. And so traditionally, training is viewed as an expense rather than an investment, which it needs to be. The difference in meeting is huge, right? An expense is just that. It's an expense, right? An expense costs money and is meant to not necessarily provide a return of value. But an investment brings a return or dividend as a result. And so when we're investing in our recruiters to develop and train them, right, we expect a return on the investment. And we show that in the way in which we support our clients. Through that training, we can increase the speed to which we submit candidates to hiring managers for consideration. We increase the speed or the ratio to the number of candidates to interview all the way through to the hire process. And so what we try to really do is find a way to customize the training for the recruiting and sourcing team that is really customized to them, right? A one-size-fits-all training, in my opinion, sometimes isn't necessarily the most respectful way to go about training. And it also can be very costly for an organization. And so not everyone can possibly need the same training is what I came to understand. And so my question rose up is why spend money on something that yields little or no ROI for us as an organization, as well as the customers we serve? And so we think of measuring job performance at the onset. We need a baseline to start with. And if you don't have that, you're sort of stabbing in the dark. And so when you have that baseline, you can then determine what training is needed, and then thereafter and continue to build on that. And so what change can be measured as a result of training? You know, if performance is not measured before that training and after, it's impossible to understand what that ROI looks like. And so as we move forward here, you know, as we go through this process, you know, what we want you to understand is where do you begin? Shally talked about how do you assess these individuals through the interview process. We're going to talk a lot about what our assessment looks like for recruiters to measure some of those areas that are very important around their technical competencies in a little bit here. But Shally, if you'll move us forward, you know, what I really want to make sure that everybody understands is that, you know, for many organizations and specifically with most HR and TA leaders, it's hard to justify a training budget because sometimes it's a smaller group of individuals in which you're trying to build the business case for having a recruiting training need. But many are often faced with on how to answer the question with their leadership is, what is your current performance? And with training, what can we expect to see as a result of that? And that's that business case that I talk about. You know, many leaders consider in-depth training as an unnecessary expense and expect really for new employees or new recruiters to learn from each other. But my question is, how do you know if those other recruiters are continuing to keep their skills fresh and learning from that area? And so through an assessment and training, we really look to identify and accurately pinpoint where there's skills gaps, specifically with individuals, versus using a blanket statement that the entire team may need some skills training. And so what we also find is that when we rely on others to help them with that training, we're expecting them to do that in addition to their current job. There's never really a carve out of time for them. And so what happens is their productivity is often lost. And then they themselves will really rely on that new recruiter or sourcer to ask others those questions that are really essential in helping them get to the next level. And I think the other point on this is that we really try to make sure that we're not doing is making an individual who may be a subpar individual or recruiter take on that training because maybe they have the bandwidth. And so there's a big gap there that you may not be using your best talent to bring your new team members into the organization in the most efficient way. And I think the other area where there's a blind spot for many of us is, are managers getting that same level of training? And what you'll often find is that, you know, managers may have been out of the recruiting realm for a number of years. And so do they truly know the latest skills and techniques that are needed in which to engage with talent? Shally mentioned this, I mentioned this, is that the war for talent is really high out there. And if you're not improving your skills on ways to engage with talent, it's going to be a costly proposition for everybody. And so we often see that through some of our assessment, we'll ask managers to really level out their own skill level against their team and help those managers get to the next level as well. And so by using a recruiter assessment, you can quickly identify focus areas by individual and by team in order to make sure that your team is meeting the needs of the business and the demands. And so what I really also find that what happens in most organizations is there's an immediate shift on where individuals aren't producing to the tools. And so organizations have to invest more. I need more recruitment advertising. I need more tools to do my job. But when you look at it at the end of the day, those tools' efficiencies and measuring those tools are not getting used to the level that they need to be used. And so it's not a tools issue. It's really a skills gap that is largely out there where organizations really need to focus that. So before we dive into the assessment, Shally's going to take us through that and give you a sense of what is the content in the assessment and how we use the assessment to look at some of the skills gap. I think I want to just, as you're going through this, ask these questions of you of how serious are you looking at your recruiting team's skills gap, right? We all want to defend our recruiting teams because it's tough out there. It's tough to find people. There's more jobs than there are talent that coming into it. There's changing dynamics of where people are going, either leaving the workforce, starting their own businesses, which isn't accounted for in some of the labor data that exists out there. And so I think it's really important to ask ourselves, how can we improve the talent that we have versus changing them out as the only recourse? And then the other piece of it is what challenges prevent your teams to really learn those new skills and actually implement those skills. To me, recruiting is about muscle memory, right? It's not like any athlete, right? It's really about their muscle memory and how they, really perform well. I mean, you look at Tom Brady, but I think at the end of the day, he's also looking at ways to enhance his skills as a whole. And so I think learning new skills is what every recruiter and sourcer craves at the end of the day, but they just don't know how to ask for the training or to identify maybe where they're lacking for some skill area. So I want to turn this over to Shally so that he can take you through what our assessment looks like through our online assessment tool.
Great. Thank you, Patty. So this is the recruiter assessment, the recruiting and sourcing assessment that Patty mentioned, and I want to show you kind of the steps that are involved in the process or the workflow of getting this done. The first thing is when individuals are registered, they receive a link. This is a unique link. This unique link will land them on a recruiter assessment welcome page that then gives them access to the questionnaire. This is a single-use link that drops them directly into the questionnaire. So they don't need to create any registration or anything like that. This would be handled through having either the entire organization or the individuals that were being assessed registered through a registration page. So from the user's point of view, the person who is being assessed, they receive this link, they click on it, they land on this page, and then they are taken through the questionnaire. It shouldn't take more than 30 minutes, could take as much as 45 for some folks. It is not timed, so they could take a little bit longer. Most individuals we find have completed this assessment in an average of about 42 minutes, but it could take a little bit longer than that. We test 6 different areas. We're testing automation skills, so these are tools, essentially. Client management, which is working with the hiring manager, concepts such as the intake meeting and developing relationships with hiring managers. Then we have a set of what we call essential skills. Think of these as the fundamental things any and every recruiter, even the most entry-level recruiter, should know. Real basic stuff, kind of like walk before you run type of skills that have things to do with managing your desk, time management, triaging email, those kinds of things. Then there's networking and marketing, both of them in the same section. Marketing as in advertising jobs, SEO, SEM, and so on, and networking as in the traditional, what we would normally call traditional networking, which used to be done face-to-face, is now done by a large degree online, but still the same basic skill set. And finally, we have outreach and search. Outreach is the emailing, calling, subject lines, effective emails, persuasive communication, texting, et cetera. And search, of course, is the identification component. And this search component includes open web search engines, as well as tools like LinkedIn and ATSs and other private databases. So once they go here, they are taken through the questions. These are all either multiple choice, multi-select, or true and false. They are 100% objective. There is no subjectivity or interpretation in these questions. And they're cross-checked in various ways so that we know if there's an answer that may conflict with another one. We have a few ways to analyze that data. So pretty straightforward, very easy to complete. You can see the choices are marked and there's a completion bar. I'm not going to take you through the entire thing, but it will go through, like I said, about 30 to 45 minutes of questions like this. At the end, they receive a thank you note, and then we go back to the view as I would see my own results, or as an individual, or I would see team results. The individual only sees their own results. Now, in this view here, we've anonymized the individuals for the sake of their privacy. We don't want to be sharing people's results with everyone. So these numbers are actually survey IDs that relate to a name in our database. If this was your result set for your organization, you would actually see the names of the people here instead of these anonymous numbers. And what you see here are the different categories and how that individual did in each of those categories. So individual 1 in all the categories, as well as how all individuals in your team did across a particular category. So for example, here, you'll notice that this subset or this team has strength in client management areas where they scored very high in comparison to the rest of the population of everyone who's completed this assessment. So, globally. And then you can see that there are areas where, there's a little bit more gaps. So it shows you the strengths and weaknesses by individual for the team. And it also can jump into some detail and recommendations. Hopefully this doesn't. Yep. Okay. Some detail and recommendations on where to focus. So for example, this individual, let's call this person Patrick, right? Their strength is in client management and their key gap is in the essentials. And it says, okay, for this, you should spend a little bit of your time, 20% of your training time or your availability on this area. These are the recommendations that are made for the individual to coach themselves. And for the team as well, we have recommendations that you can see. So there's a great level of detail. These all have drill downs that allow you to look at the specific skills. Is it emailing? Is it searching? Is it automation? Is it, the fundamentals and so on? Once again, this is listed by individual practitioner here if you want to highlight that, or by area if you want to highlight that. So that is, in a nutshell, looks like it's asking me to log back in here. So let me go back to the slides there. That is in a nutshell how the recruiter assessment survey or questionnaire works. Patty, did you want me to show anything in addition?
No, I think, maybe Shally, talk about quite often the questions we get are, how is this validated, right? Because we think of this as an assessment out there. And, are these used in hiring decisions? You want to talk a little bit about that from an assessment perspective.
Good. So these are skills-based questions. They are all skills-based questions, so they are not subjective. That gives us the protection that, these are questions regarding things that they need to be doing on the job. We're not using these questions as a way to determine a competency or something that we would need to validate. So those types of validated assessments are more on the competencies, personality, psychological assessments, and so on. This is strictly skills. So it'd be similar to testing someone on Excel skills. There's a standard set of things that you can do with Excel. Someone either knows how to do that thing with Excel or they don't, or they have some mastery, or they have a strength or they have a weakness in that area, but it's specifically related to a skill. The second part of this is we're not necessarily using this as an instrument to determine who gets the job, but we are using this as an instrument to compare individuals to the team, compare the team to global numbers, and it helps inform our coaching decision and our in other decisions that we may need to make, not necessarily a hire or not hire. So there's not a pass fail, although you do see percentages on here. the percentages relate to a global average or a team average. They don't relate to a passing or failing score. So a 33% or 16%, as you can see over here, that does not mean this person would be failed and would not be hired as a result. It just simply shows that that's an area where there's opportunity versus these other 3 areas or 4 areas where they have strengths. So for that reason, it's not helping us determine hire, fire, or promote. It's just helping us determine where their strengths are that we can leverage. One other result here or outcome here is that we're able to leverage individuals' strengths across the organization. So for example, if there's someone who is exceptionally talented at client management, having the highest score, perhaps that individual can be in a position to be made an internal subject matter expert and coach other individuals that might not have scored as highly. So you can use this as a internal coaching matching or matchmaking tool as well. Thanks for asking that question, Patty.
Definitely. And I think the other thing for everyone to keep in mind is that as individuals progress through each of these segment areas or these topic areas, the questions get progressively harder, right? So if you're going through this and answering these questions, they're not going to be all easy questions. You're going to be really tested to understand those skills. And as Shally talked about is, the ability to use individuals through your onboarding who may be well-versed in client management, but maybe somebody else is really strong in outreach. And so now when you do an onboarding with your team, you're not delegating all of that to one individual. You're maximizing the team strength to help others continue to grow. And then also allow those individuals to advance in their own skills as well, where maybe they need some help with automation or other essentials. So it's a great way to really leverage the expertise of your team members and to really get them to be more proficient.
You can see that. Was there a question that came in? If someone starts and stops, can they come back and restart previously? So they can return where they stopped. Once they complete the assessment, that loop is closed. They can take a second one. And in fact, that's another way to leverage something like this, which would be a before and after picture, where you might start the development cycle, their skills development cycle, by taking a snapshot of where they are right now, then proceed on to some skills development, training, coaching, etc., and then take another picture later, so you can actually show remarkable progress or otherwise, right? You can show the difference before and after, and hopefully see the entire group skill on average elevate throughout that development. So it can be taken multiple times, but the individual cycle of one assessment closes once they finish the last question and submit. Then they have to start over. There was a question about the types of questions asked. Absolutely. So I briefly had that up on the screen. Pardon me, I'll start that screen back up again so you can see some examples. So here is, I'll share the first couple here. So for example, it'd be methods for organizing information and prioritizing information. It doesn't let me continue until I answer, so I'm going to randomly select a few here. But you can see things about time management and speed reading, things around search tools and search commands, subject lines of emails, and so on. And for the most part, they're either multiple choice, single select, or they're multiple choice, multi-select, as in select all that apply. Occasionally, there'll be a few true and false, which I guess is still multiple choice, single select. But they're pretty straightforward. So we're trying to not, we've tried to not make the test taking or the assessment taking itself be something that prohibits people from doing it. And we've had people successfully complete this assessment that have low visibility or are blind and using screen readers. So it is definitely 501 compliant, and really nobody should have any trouble completing the questions. Now, answering them, we do encourage people at the beginning. There's a message that says, try not to go and look up the answers, although you do have the time to do that. The point here is not to get it right, because you're not going to get a grade that says, oh, Shally is better than Patrick because he got a 73 instead of a 72. The point is to identify gaps, strengths, and opportunities So it's best to go through this and answer in the best of your ability at the time. As I said, you can always retake it later on. So don't look at this as a test of my worth as a recruiter or sourcer, but more of an assessment or an inventory of what my skills are or may not be.
And Shally, another question came in through the chat. Are there individual assessments for sourcers versus recruiters?
Both recruiter and sourcer are treated the same because recruiting is first and sourcing becomes the specialization. So in the outcome, we can see from the scores whether someone has the sourcing aptitude or not. Essentially, a big area there would be search. So this could be a distinguishing factor in a team where you have a number of associates. Some may be recruiters, some may be sourcers. You would expect that the people who are more versed in areas like search would be sourcers. But there again, this is why this is such a telling instrument, because if your sourcers don't do so well in search, but your recruiters do, then we need to look at possibly why that's happening. So we don't distinguish a questionnaire for one role versus the other, but we interpret the outcome in that light. Meaning this could even be a test or an assessment, I should use that instead, that is given to someone who is a coordinator and beginning their journey in sourcing and recruiting. Or it can be given to a manager, and that manager then could use this as a way to, okay, what are the areas where I'm particularly strong, and then could serve as a coach to the rest of the organization. So we don't distinguish that up front.
And Shally, another question came in specific to, what we're assessing in the searching. So do you want to just off the top of your head sort of talk about what are the types of questions that you're using, that we use inside of the searching?
Absolutely. So we are talking about the basic logic around search. Some people call that Boolean logic, although that's just 3 and or not commands. So it's a lot more than that. But it's the thought processes around searching with commands, using natural language phrases. It's the tools, for example, LinkedIn. There's an area of questions that revolve around just specifically searching LinkedIn, searching your ATS, those kinds of questions. So it's testing their knowledge in the concept of search, not their fluency in a particular language of search. So it's not saying, okay, Shally's good at Google and Patrick is good at Bing. It's saying Shally's strong at the concepts of search versus natural language versus and so on. And that detail is found broken down here. So for example, under search, you see a few of these people lookups, peer regression, specialized Google commands that are a little bit more specific. That's an area where we see a lot of folks with typically lower scores, because now we're looking at just commands that are only for Google, and not everybody knows that. So you can see it's a pretty broad area. Each of these, by the way, behind the scenes is further broken down into specific questions. So we are showing only the subcategory of search, but there are a number of various questions that cross-examine. And as Patty mentioned, levels of difficulty from 1 to 3. So easy, medium, and hard. And then there are questions that also correlate. So we are not making a statement about someone's knowledge or lack of knowledge in search because of one question that they missed because they guessed incorrectly or something like that. There's correlation. Now, those questions themselves, we do want to keep those, confidential for the reason that although we don't expect people are going to go cheat because they're really cheating themselves, we also don't want the answers to be out there floating around. So that's why the questions themselves are kind of behind the scenes.
And our other question is, are there questions that are specific to technical versus non-technical?
No, the core competencies remain the same. So whether you are searching for accountants, salespeople, or software engineers, the search is still the concept. Whether you are reaching out to people using email, those people may be executives, they may be technicians, or they may be mechanics. There's some core competencies or some basic requirements that what lands you in spam, for example. What are the things that will get you caught on a spam filter? This doesn't rely on tech or non-tech or industry. You can determine from the answers, you can determine an individual's ability, skills for a particular type of recruiting if you know that for that recruiting, you rely more on email. So for example, you may already know that for recruiting for these types of candidates, email is more effective than, say, cold calling or texting. Then if this individual is scoring higher on email, then that shows a good match. But if this particular job requires a lot more texting and this individual doesn't have, doesn't score very well on texting, then you know that in order to prepare this individual better for that industry, you'll need to strengthen that particular competency. So it's based on their skills across the entire universe of recruiting, not a particular type of recruiting.
I want to bring in one other question I see in the chat. It might be buried there. You missed it, Patty, but the question, it's a good one. From the assessment, so past the assessment, as organizations identify the areas that need development for the recruiters and resources, does your organization offer training as well?
We do, Lemise, and it's a great question. So at the once this assessment is actually reviewed and shared either through the leader in the organization or individuals, there are specific training paths and courses that are available for individuals to take to improve that. They're often delivered through live webinar sessions with accompanying documents that come with that. So team members have access to that information. And then what we typically advise is that once you sort of have this baseline assessment done, you go back and reassess those individuals to see how well they've done through those training courses to see if those scores improve. The one piece that we didn't show you here, and it's more for confidentiality's sake, is that you can then assess your team across the industry standards. So we have this assessment out through hundreds of teams and individuals in this recruiting and sourcing sector. So you can see where your team is benchmarked against another one. So there's a lot of ways that we can support through the training paths as well.
Very good. And we'll take a couple more questions. There's a lot of interest from the audience and a lot of great questions. So probably a couple more before we wrap up and stay with our time. I was curious as well, Shally or Patty, how often would you recommend organizations assess their resources? Is that once a year? What kind of frequency would you recommend?
So Shally, why don't you go ahead and take that?
I think it's a good idea to start at the beginning when someone has joined the organization, so you have a good before picture. I don't know if I would advise any specific frequency or cadence after that. I think it would be something that matches your internal development cycle. So if you're going to send them to some training, send them to a conference, you can utilize the recommendations that we provide. Think of this assessment as providing a prescription. You can then take that prescription and fill it at any pharmacy. Obviously, we have a house pharmacy that we'd like for you to use, but you're not required or bound to that. You can develop your own, you can purchase others, and so on. So I would say after you've gone through an evolution of that and completed another program, whether it's ours or someone else's, rather than saying every year, let's take a look at, we're going to send everybody to a conference and we're going to send them to 2 conferences this year. At the end of the year, then we'll do another assessment and see if, having sent them to these conferences was worthwhile. Did they pick up any additional skills? So it doesn't necessarily have to be, on a yearly basis. Now, that said, you may have a program where there's continuous development and internal coaching. In that case, then you probably want to create a cadence that's reflective of that. I've seen some organizations have requirements where they have a quarterly webinar or they have some sort of quarterly or monthly lesson. So that's going to depend on you, but I don't really prescribe anything specifically related to a cadence.
Very good. And I think the one other clarification, if you can help us, Shally, since we have a mixed audience and we have for different jobs and different organization representations from recruiting and RPO agencies versus the direct employer. Now, your assessment tools, these are not available for individuals. These are for organizations. Is that correct?
Teams, right? So, you as the organization can assign the assessment to individuals in your organization, but if somebody is not going to be able to go online, use a credit card and pay, $20 to take the test. This is a team-based approach. We really haven't defined what the size of a team would be. So if you have 4 people, 12 people, 17 people, one of the things that we can do with if you might notice some of the interfaces, it looks familiar. It's because the visualizations are being done through pretty traditional visualization techniques such as Power BI. So one of the things we can do is if we know in advance that there are groups, for example, so you have 100 recruiters and 20 of them are industry, 20 of them are technology or whatever, you can group them that way so that when a team leader, the team leader of the 20 that are industry logs in, they see their group compared to the entire organization, compared to the world. So we can group them that way if we know in advance coming into it, but it doesn't really, there's no defined team size.
Very cool. So that was excellent webinar today, and we loved having you both, Patty and Shally. Thank you so much for your time. Patty, any last points here or any last thoughts before we wrap up our webinar today? And you're very good.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Just wanted to thank you for the opportunity, and for those that did attend, feel free to reach out to myself or Shally. Numbers are here. We're happy to help and just brainstorm ideas with you as well. So thank you all, and hope that you felt that this information will be useful as you think about your next training and development for your recruiting teams. Take care, everyone, and happy holidays to you.
Thanks, everybody.
And thank you both. If I may have a minute, I do want to, we have a lot of new audience to the RPOA, so I do want to take a minute and just introduce our audience to some of our resources as well, and the organization. So if you're new to the RPOA, the Recruitment Process Outsourcing Association is a member-driven, mission-driven organization serving the global RPO ecosystem and striving to be the place to go for RPO. Our mission is to nurture a collaborative community where thought leadership can be created and curated to educate the marketplace about RPO. As an organization, the RPOA serves the global RPO community. This includes anyone in talent acquisition interested in RPO. That includes RPO providers, buyers, recruiting technology providers, HR consultants, analysts, and academics. We produce quality content in collaboration with corporate members and sponsors like Aspirant on our call today. Our content is focused on talent acquisition trends and best practices for the RPO community. The RPO Leadership Forum is a webinar series hosted on the third Tuesday of each month at noon Eastern Time. This is our last webinar for this year, and we will resume our monthly schedule in January and should have a new and great lineup of speakers and topics. So mark your calendar for the third Tuesday of January for our next event. You can find upcoming events from the RPOA on the website under events. The recordings for our webinars and other content you can find on the RPO Academy, also available on the website. We hosted our second annual RPOA conference on October 12th. Conference sessions are currently available to watch on demand. I invite all of you to access those. With that, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Please stay connected, stay engaged, and stay informed of what's happening in the talent acquisition and RPO world by tuning into the RPOA, the place to go for RPO. Thank you again for our wonderful speakers. Patty and Shally, would love to have you again sometime soon. And see you all again. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Lamise. Bye-bye.